So thank you everyone for loading. There we go. Joining our UCSB Comm Alumni Council monthly virtual career series. Because we haven't been able to get together in person this year for great events like Career Day and other mentoring fall events, things like that have all had to be postponed. We wanted to still connect with wonderful students and alumni on topics that matter to us because they're the jobs that we do every day. And also might be of interest to you in terms of learning about future career in a space that one of our council members works in. So we put together this virtual career series to basically take the career day kind of environment and put it into a virtual setting. So I know it's not exactly the same as meeting in Corwin and having a ton of fun, but we've got some great speakers here tonight and on a basically every month, 4-week or so basis to talk about their careers. So tonight we have, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a second, but Careers in Law with Karen and Jake, and I'm going to turn it over to them in a second. We have another one coming up, our last one of the year on December 9th, Careers in Marketing with Justin, who's also on this call, which will be very exciting. And all of our RSVPs are linked here. This has been on our social, it's on the department website. So multiple ways for you to learn more about it and get to the Eventbrite link. This is just a little more information. I don't know if we need to go into this in full, but here is the schedule of upcoming events. So we've got a lot more coming up in 2021 as well. And I don't know, Jeanette, do you want me to walk through any of these additional slides? I think just the overview.
No, that's fine. Just the schedule's great.
Perfect. All right, so that's what we've got. Very excited to introduce Karen and Jake and to talk about their careers in law. So with that, Karen, why don't you kick us off with an introduction? We'll pass it to Jake and then we can wrap back around to you, Karen, to tell us a little bit about your career journey.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad that Jake and I are doing this together because we're both in different areas of the law and different phases of our career. So I graduated from UCSB as a comm major in 1990. So yeah, that was 30 years ago. I've been practicing law for 25 years. I went to UCLA for law school. And I started out going to a big law firm, which is currently in the news quite a bit over the elections, which is Jones Day. I was a litigator there for 6 years, and then I switched firms because I wanted to be more focused on intellectual property, copyright specifically. So I went to a firm that is not as large as Jones Day, and Jones Day's in the news because they've been working for Trump for the last few years. And they're being targeted by the Lincoln Project, which I think is great. I have no loyalty to them. So my next firm, it's a firm called Loeb & Loeb, and it is really has its roots in entertainment, media, advertising, and related issues. It is a full service law firm, but I did go there to be a copyright litigator, and I did a lot of work for the studios for the 10 years I was there, and I became a partner at Loeb & Loeb. And then ultimately I ended up going to work for the Motion Picture Association, which is actually a trade organization. So we represent the major motion picture studios in the US and also Netflix. We're also part of a larger alliance that includes 30 other companies, including Amazon and a number of companies that are outside of the US. And I oversee our worldwide anti-piracy litigation, which we call content protection because that sounds friendlier than anti-something. So my role's global, and I have lawyers in our offices around the world that report into me who are also managing their local copyright litigation. So that's sort of the broad strokes on me, and I'm happy to talk more later and answer questions. So I'll hand it over to Jake.
All right, great. Thanks, Karen. So I guess I have a lot shorter list because I'm just 1 year out of law school, but I'm UCSB class of 2014. So once I graduated from UCSB, I worked for just about 2 years in California at an education technology company. It's called Course Hero. They sort of have notes and students can share their materials and stuff like that online. So I did that for 2 years, and then Started law school 2016. So I'm originally from Maryland. I came back to DC for that. So I went to GW. 3 years later, 2019, took the bar and then started my job at, I guess what you'd call a big law firm. So like in the same boat as Jones Day, as Karen mentioned. And I've been doing that for a year and 2 months. So I'm currently in the asset management space. So that basically means our clients are asset managers. So that tends to be sponsors of mutual funds or ETFs, or if you have a retirement account or something like that, we manage the regulatory side of that business. So that's what I do now. Yeah, and as Karen said, we're happy to answer questions. Or Alex, I don't know if you have stuff ready for us to go or what the case might be.
Yeah, I mean, I can ask a number of questions for both of you, but I think the really interesting part of having both of you on today is that we kind of get both sides of the career story, which was the intent. So I'm hoping that with those kind of brief introductions, Karen, we might be able to turn it over to you to give us more insight into your longer career story, especially around how you ended up, taking a career in communication and then maturing it into a full-fledged career in global law. So that's the first question I'd have for you, and it can be as long of an explanation as it needs to be. And then Jake will do a little bit more of a deep dive into your journey, taking your degree into where you are now.
Yeah, thanks. Sure, happy to do that. So when I was at UCSB and I was a comms major, which was before you had to actually be a pre-major, you could go straight into it back then. One of the classes that I was most interested in was actually ethics class that was, was related to philosophy. And one of the things that you learn in there is how to do an ethical proof. And that sort of logic, it's a logical chain of argument, really appealed to me. And I felt like that was something that I was good at, with being logical. I know that sounds really broad. So I was interested in that, and I took a number of courses which you probably wouldn't think would necessarily help you in a law degree, sort of mass communications type courses, but there were just some little tips that I picked up through those classes about what kind of messaging appeals to people. So like one thing that I always remember, and I've already shared with some people that are on this call, is that, there's research to say that people like threes. I mean, 3 is the magic number, right? So they like lists of threes. So when I'm trying to craft an argument, when I was writing briefs myself, which I don't do anymore because we use outside counsel, but I would try to have 3 main points, if at all possible. Sometimes that you have to have more, but that's how I would try to structure an argument, because people really can't process that much more information. And there were just little things like that, which I kept in my mind, and about, having concise messaging. And then there's also things, obviously, that I did learn about the media while I was at Santa Barbara. It was the first time that I really learned about gatekeeping and the idea that there are a finite number of people that are controlling the messaging, whether that's through the news networks or through the entertainment that we see on the movie screen. And that we're also exporting a lot of our culture around the world through the media. And so I was just really sort of interested in all that, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until my senior year at UCSB that I decided that I wanted to go to law school, and didn't really have, I hadn't really taken the LSAT at the right time to be able to go straight through, which I think actually was kind of a blessing. Because I spent 1 year, I moved to Los Angeles and spent a year working for an Italian food importer. And I did really exciting things like input orders before the trucks went out to deliver at all the big restaurants in LA. And I did get to go to small claims court because we had to sue a lot of our restaurant clients for not paying their bills, because most restaurants go bankrupt in the first 20 to 30 days. And you can't be a lawyer in small claims court. So I would go with the credit manager and, get all the evidence together and help out on that. And ultimately I got my first legal job through contacts there, which was the law firm it was my summer internship after my first year of law school. The law firm that they were using agreed to have me be an intern after my first year, which I think Jake could probably talk about that too, is that's like the hardest time to actually get an internship as a law student is after your first year, because it's highly competitive. So maybe I'll leave it there and let Jake tell his story.
Sure. So I like the rule of three. I think they should teach that in law school if they don't. But I actually went back and looked at my transcript just to remind myself of what I took. And then I also looked at what's being currently offered. And there's actually a lot of great courses. I think communication is a really great major for attorneys because it teaches, the research skills and the writing skills. Like once you start talking to lawyers, that's what they'll sort of repeat over and over. And lawyers have to be good writers. They have to be good researchers. And I mean, that's the bulk of what I do now. There's also, a lot of talking on the phone, and I don't go to court, but if you do that, in-person communication. So also from a policy perspective, which is kind of interesting, I don't necessarily do policy work. Maybe Karen, that's more so what you do or intersects at some point. But, for people interested in more so like government work or working for a regulator, the media policy classes I took too, like I read electronic media policy. There's also an interviewing class. I'm not sure if that's still taught, but that's great for depositions or anything else you're doing as far as client work. So I don't know if I had a clear goal from the get-go to go to law school, but I did take the LSAT my senior year and then just sat on it for a couple of years. As I said, I went to go work for a bit, which I think was a good thing. Going straight through seems a little overwhelming to me. Everyone's different, but yeah, I'm happy where I ended up. And the other thing I would add is in the space I work in currently in my firm, it's very finance heavy. It's not something I necessarily had a background as a communication undergrad, and it's not necessarily something I studied in law school, but having those research skills and developing those as an undergrad, means that hopefully you can learn something else, kind of from the ground up. So that's how I saw it, and that's what I found most helpful with my major.
Some really, interesting stories between the two of you. I love, Jake, that you actually pulled up the classes that you took and you kind of scoured what's on offer now. I've done that before, and it's very cool to see what's on the docket at UCSB. They're offering some really interesting courses. So
yeah, I would never be able to find my transcript, by the way. I think, I showed it for my first job, and then after that, they're just looking at where you were working before. I mean, I've only had 3 jobs in 30 years, so that's not really that many.
So you mentioned Karen at least, and then Jake, Karen mentioned you may have had this experience as well, but as far as being an intern, how is that, similar or different for someone, that is in law school or that's looking to go into a career in law? What types of internships would you be looking at? Do they overlap with other more general internships that would apply to their comm majors? How would you kind of approach that internship experience with the direction of a career in law?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of depends on where your interest lies, right? So if you're thinking that you want to ultimately end up at a firm, like a medium, small, or large firm, one of the things about law school is that whole process of finding a summer clerkship is very structured. Almost all the major schools, I'm sure, UCLA and George Washington both did this, have the law firms come in. You can put your name in for an interview. You get put on a list, at least at UCLA, that's how it worked. And you go and maybe you interview with 8 firms or 10 firms over a few days. And then they have follow-up. Sometimes they'll invite you back to their office to have another interview with more people. And those, if you're doing well, those are pretty easy for you to end up finding something after your second year. So a lot of people find their jobs that way. But if you're interested more in, say, public interest work, or you just want to see what it's like to work at a media company, then you'd probably be on a slightly different path. I think some of the big public interest groups do come in to the campuses and interview as well. But then, like all all of the companies, like all of the entertainment companies, for example, will have posted on their websites if they're offering any internships. Those are probably pretty competitive, especially because I think there's been a big change in unpaid internships, and that most major media companies don't want to do that anymore because it disadvantages people that really need to be paid something during their summer. So they're a little bit fewer. But Jake's experience is probably more recent than mine, so maybe he has some things to add about it.
Yeah, I think what you said is about right. Still, I think getting an internship in law or like at a law firm or anything legal related, you have to be in law school. So I guess that's something to note. I did, as I said, like even my job before law school, as an undergrad, I did nothing legal related. So as far as like a prerequisite for law school, I'd say, you can do anything that seems interesting or, that's out there. Being a paralegal is always an option right out of college if you sort of want to get a taste for big law. Personally, I think it's a pretty tough job. But I know paralegals from my firm, even one, recently, after 4 or 5 years or so, left to go to law school. I think that's sometimes a pretty common route. So that's something to think about as far as getting exposure to law. But yeah, I'd say, anything's good practice, anything, reading, research. I did a bunch of different stuff in college. I worked on the Hill one summer. That was kind of interesting, not necessarily exactly legal related, but getting exposure to at least the lawmaking process. So yeah, as an undergrad, I'd say just go out there and see what you can get.
Awesome. And as Jeanette mentioned in the chat, feel free to type questions in the chat for Karen or Jake or both. Leslie has added one in here, which we can go to next. What was the best piece of advice both of you received while undergraduates? Karen, you want to go first?
Oh, gee. I'm not sure I got any advice. Let me think. Maybe it's not advice somebody gave me, but the advice that I would give if I were back in my shoes then. I think it's important, especially with respect to the law, to sort of go into it with a broad view and an open mind about what you want to do precisely. A lot of people that I started at my firm with, when I started at Jones Day, you spent a year not assigned to any group. You weren't yet in a practice group, and you could try different things. And a lot of people who thought they wanted to be litigators and be in court realized that was not something they wanted to do, because it's such a hostile relationship that you have with the lawyers on the other side. It's very combative. There are winners and losers. And so a lot of people moved into more transactional work or different kinds of work, and they had that opportunity to do it. And so one of the things like I find is that when I used to do a lot of recruiting for both of my law firms, is people that come into an interview after, their second year of law school and say, one, that they know exactly what they want to do, and two, that they know all these things about the firm, and they almost always have large parts of that wrong. So it's much better, I think, to go in with an open mind and just to be partially in listening mode. Interviewing is not just about selling yourself, but it's also about learning more about whether there's really going to be a fit.
Yeah, I can add, I don't know, I can't remember like a particular instance of, someone giving me advice, I guess, but, as an undergrad and in law school, the interview process first year is, I think I maybe went to some nights 2-3 events a night at different law firms, and you're just talking, and lawyers love to talk about themselves, about what they're working on. So, learning how to, Karen shaking her head, yes. It's definitely true. So, learning how to talk to people, getting used to it, lots of different people. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily about your interests or what you're in, just talking about whatever's going on, current events, whatever it might be. So getting used to doing that, I think, is important as a lawyer, when you're in law school, even as an undergrad. So going to events, I've had opportunities kind of come to me just randomly, maybe a certain event even I wasn't planning on going to, but you go anyway and just never know who you're going to meet. So yeah, that's important. Definitely for law school. In the interviews, I don't even think I was, I like to think your grades sort of speak for themselves. And even in interviews, you're not like asked legal questions. It's not like some complicated fact set. They actually really just want to get to know you. So getting comfortable doing that, as I said, just talking to people, and that'll serve you well.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, how I ended up at Jones Day was that there was one of the things that UCLA did at that time was they had this dinner with an alum, which was supposed to be when it first started, it was always at the alum's house, actually. So I ended up signing up for one, and I got assigned because I was living in Pasadena, which was far away from the law school at the time. So I was assigned to a partner from Jones Day that lived in Pasadena near where I lived. And I showed up for the dinner, and it turns out his wife was also a partner, a litigator at Jones Day. And then they brought one senior associate to have dinner too. And, I was over 21, so we had a very long dinner with lots of wine. And then I interviewed with Jones Day on campus, and they already had a note in their file saying like, this person's recommended by the partners that I met. So I ended up getting a call back. And when I went to the interview, I'd actually spent this whole evening with these 3 lawyers. I was probably there for like 3 or 4 hours or something like that. And then I had like my sort of final interview of the day. And, you always want to have a question when the person who's interviewing you says, do you have any questions? So I asked a bunch of questions, and then there was still obviously time left. And I finally just said, if you were sitting in my seat, knowing exactly what you know today, but in my seat, what's the question that you would ask? He said, I would ask, how many hours am I really going to work? And I said, okay, how many hours am I really going to work? And he said, you're going to work like 200 hours a month. That's what it's going to be like. And sometimes you're going to be here all night, and it's not going to be fun. And so to Jake's point, one of the things that I think they're really looking for, at least in the firm environment, is, are you somebody that they want to spend 15 hours a day working with when you're getting ready for trial? And, how are you going to hold up in that? And I think it's important because of that to be yourself. If you're a funny person, be your funny self. If you like to tell stories. And, I think it matters a lot more than people think. To Jake's point, the pedigree of your school and your grades matter to them as a gating issue. But at the end of the day, it's whether they think you can communicate well, because you're not going to be successful as a lawyer if you can't have conversations with your clients and become friends with them and be people that they want to be around. So, yeah.
I think that applies to so many different career paths, right? I mean, it can go a little bit far when you get, and forgive me for saying this, college students, the fraternity type experience, which we at Procore often got a lot. I work at Procore down in Carpinteria. And I think the we're friends before we're coworkers can go a little bit far, especially in the startup world. But I think there's a very healthy balance of being friends with those that you work with and wanting to be around them. And I totally agree. I mean, I interviewed for that as well, for skill, but also to make sure that I want to work with this person. I want them on my team. I can trust them, and we're going to get along, and we're going to do really good work together. So I love that. And I love that story, Karen, of the long dinner with lots of wine. I think we've all had 1 or 2 of those in networking days. So fun stories to hear. Love this question from Matt. I think it's great. Where do you both see the evolution of law heading in the next several years? And he specifies not necessarily the laws themselves, but the professional industry.
I think, well, one of my guesses would be that this pandemic has actually made law firms have to recognize that they can actually trust their lawyers and their staff to work remotely. So I think you're going to see a lot of law firms either downsizing their offices so that they don't have as much physical space, letting their lawyers work from not having to be in the big city, but working from, sort of outskirts. There's already firms that have been doing that for a while in the UK, where they'll have like they just have this office in London that they come into only when they have to, but they all actually the real office is off in a suburb where people can have big houses and send their kids to good schools. So I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, that's not so much about the evolution of the law, but just of the practice. I would expect that to be the biggest change coming. And I think it'll be partially driven also by the tech companies that have, huge groups of internal lawyers as well. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm hoping that that is the case. I think a lot of us are hoping that there's more flexibility. I don't know if it's a law firm thing in general, but yeah, my firm always wanted people to be in the office, which I always thought was kind of odd because if you are working on something yourself, a lot of people had their doors closed, you're on the phone a lot of the time. And yeah, as Karen said, things seem to be working just fine at home. I do miss some of the law firm events that maybe I reference, people talking and drinking and eating and all that type of stuff. I mean, as far as the industry, I've only been in it for 1 year, so I don't see it changing much. I mean, unless there's some drastic change to how laws are created, and I guess for purposes of my job, more so the agencies and the executive branch. But I don't necessarily see that happening. But
I guess another change that I think is coming, at least I've seen it with the companies that are members of the MPA and the MPA itself, is that, sort of the fallout of all the unrest that we had, everybody focusing sort of on social justice, that all the big companies are starting to be much more proactive with their diversity, inclusion, etc. policies. And so I think you're going to see the law firms under a lot more pressure to actually be diverse. There's been a lot of advances made in recent years, but still, like when I was a litigation partner at my firm, there were 25 litigation partners in our Century City office, and there were 2 or 3 of them only that were women at any given time. So I think you'll see that changing, but also, just more diverse backgrounds. There's going to be pressure on firms to do that. And I think that that's a great thing. And it'll be, helpful for everybody, not just for people of color or just for people that have diverse backgrounds, but it's going to allow you to have sort of a more robust and varied views in your firms. And I think that'll be helpful. And that'll be a change.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those changes that you just mentioned are happening in a lot of other industries. And it's sometimes my boyfriend's sister is in law, and she had very similar experience to you, Jake, where even during the pandemic, it was like, we'll come back into the office, right? That's how we do things in this industry. We work from an office, and even they're starting to, shift that mentality kind of along with the rest of other tech companies, obviously very, very far out front, are like, oh, we're giving up all of our office space. But it's interesting to hear how, the legal industry may also be shifting in that way. And then I think as far as your point, Karen, on diversity, I mean, definitely there's so much more in-housing of that as a programmatic aspect of, intelligent business. And I can see how that might kind of translate over to the legal space as well. Also in-housing of, internal counsel and lawyers. We have a deployment law person at Procore now, because it's just such a focus on making sure that we do these things right. And especially in a remote place, like, big focus on that. So I think that's very interesting, just to tie that to my very personal experience in tech. Before I move on to Ron's question, I was wondering if any of the students on the call had any questions. I know it might be intimidating to ask on a Zoom full of Comm Council folks, but we'd love to hear from you if you do have thoughts in the chat, or you can just come off mute and ask a question if you'd like. I go to gallery view maybe. We can see everyone now. All right, well, why don't you plug some questions into the chat if you have anything, and we will jump to Ron's question. All right, Ron's question is for Karen. What are some interesting differences in copyright and intellectual property across different countries?
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, I think one of the big differences is in the European Union, they have this copyright directive that acknowledges that sometimes the party that is best placed to impact or end the infringement is not a party that's doing anything wrong. So for example, in the UK, you can get an order, or in most of the EU, you can get an order that requires an internet service provider to no longer allow their customers to reach a pirate site that's been adjudicated as infringing. And you can also get a similar order, say, against a company that's actually providing the hosting infrastructure for a pirate operation. And sometimes as well to domain name registries and registrars to have the domain blocked or seized or frozen and not be able to resolve to the site. So you have, I think in some ways, people view that as a better system because you don't have to be always pointing the finger at somebody. You have your application relates to a pirate site that the court accepts as infringing, but you just have, you're getting relief with this other party without having to put them in an adverse position to you where they're going to want to fight against you. So that's one issue. I think the other big difference you see is really the resources that are given to intellectual property and other cyber crimes in some of the sort of emerging markets. It's just very new to them, and we have to spend a lot of our time educating law enforcement. We do a lot of trainings with law enforcement about intellectual property, internet issues, because we do a lot of criminal referrals globally. That's probably our most powerful tool because it has the most deterrent impact, and we try to limit our civil litigation to where we're trying to establish legal precedent or make examples of some of the worst that we can reach. And, you know, in China, for example, the laws are actually decent. The issue is that you don't get much in the way of relief when you win a case. You usually, this is very strange for American lawyers, usually get an apology ordered by the court on behalf by the defendant has to apologize. Usually can get some very sort of low level of damages. Interestingly, in China, every copyrighted work has to be a separate lawsuit. So when we go after a big pirate site that has all our members' content, we sometimes have to file up to 100 separate suits to get the damage exposure big enough to actually have any impact at all. Whereas in the US, if you have a group of rights holders and it's a single site that's infringing all of their stuff, you would get to run one single case that involved all of that. And the US has statutory damages, which means there's a calculation that can be done. So you don't have to go through the real pain of trying to prove what your losses were because of the piracy, which is very difficult for studios to really say how many more people would have bought tickets, how many more people would have paid for a streaming service, how many more people would have bought the DVD. So yeah, there's a lot of variety around the world, and that's been actually one of the most interesting things for me. There are two issues I'd say for my job that are most interesting. One was that, you know, when I was working at my first two law firms, everything I did was domestic US law, never anything international. And then the other is just that the technology of piracy is changing. So I've been working in this space since about 2004. So it's gone from peer-to-peer to, over time to more linking and streaming of content. Then there was this big use of these preloaded set-top boxes and the Kodi technology. So it's always changing. And even though I'm not a super technical person, I have to stay up on all that and understand it so I can agree with my colleagues of what are the good targets for us to go after and how do they fit under the copyright law.
That's a lot to keep up with for sure. You have a lot of domain expertise there, Karen. I was thinking about the rule of three while you were chatting too, and I was wondering if we could ask Jeanette's question that she posted with that rule of three. So if you could share the top three things that occur during a typical day for you so that students can hear kind of what it's like to be a working attorney or in the legal field kind of actively. So top three things. Jake, how about you start?
Okay, it's an interesting question. Well, I'm at the very bottom of the firm, so usually it's just someone asking me for something urgent, or someone higher up sort of asking me to clarify a small question on something. The partners are doing a lot of the big picture stuff. They're interfacing with clients. I do get some exposure to clients, but because I'm so new, it's not. I don't even want it to be that much. It can be scary, but yeah, usually just have a couple emails from a partner asking me to research something or type up something. Lots of email management, I'd say also. Like this might just be for a lot of different jobs, but lawyers like to CC like 10 people on every email. So, and usually it's not even addressed to me. It doesn't even really involve me. It's just sort of a project you're on, and it's to keep track of what's going on. So email management, that's another thing I'd say I deal with. And then 3, I don't know. Every day's different, so it's always a surprise, especially in my role.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that as number one is whatever when you're coming into your office, and that may be just walking into another room in your house, but that you think this is what I'm going to do today. Now I finally have time to do this. And then there's always some pivot, some minor crisis or some issue that you weren't planning on. So that's 1. 2 is I don't think since this pandemic started and we were all working from home that I have had a single day without a video call. Our company usually did many in-person meetings where the studios would each send 2, 3, 4, 5 people. So these meetings are like 60, 70 people sometimes. And now we're doing them all on Zoom. And then we also are doing all our internal discussions on Zoom since we're not or WebEx, because we're not in the same room together. And then 3 is probably one of the biggest things I have to do in my job is what we call herding the cats. We have to get 6 companies when we're talking about MPA matters to all agree to something, which requires somebody to be trying to figure out a path forward where you can get divergent companies with divergent views together with some small compromises. And we also, as I mentioned, have this alliance, which has more votes. So we have to deal with that as well. So those are sort of the 3 things I do probably in every day. Is try and build consensus, get on a video conference call, or 4 or 5. Sometimes I've had 6 hours in a row once, which almost killed me. So that's fine.
Zoom fatigue is very real. Well, as we near the 45-minute mark, why don't we do one last question to both of you, which is for the students that are on here today. What is one thing you would like them to take away from this conversation about pursuing a career in law? It could be an inspirational takeaway, it could be a reminder, it could be a lesson that you've learned, a challenge that you've overcome. What's one thing you'd like them to walk away with from this conversation? And either of you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is, I sort of said it before, but I think there's so many different things you can do with a law degree that I wouldn't try to pigeonhole myself into a specific path early on. I mean, even on my own trajectory, I started working just on complex litigation. So I had like one case that I worked on for 3 years. There were always like $70 million cases. And then I just decided that I really wanted to do something that didn't involve reviewing 600 boxes of documents. And that's why I went to copyright, because usually you have their idea script, your idea script, or just full out theft. And so there's not a lot of documents involved, and it's much more legal theory, which I enjoy more than the reviewing of huge reams of data. But you might find that what you thought you were going to like, you don't like at all. That's the real point.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Like, law is very broad. I also said it too, similar to Karen. I studied something as undergrad and even worked in something afterwards that's unrelated to what I'm doing now in the legal field. And there's always opportunities afterwards. A lot of lawyers go into business or, leave law completely after a couple of years, 10, 20 years, whatever it might be. And my other advice would be take all of your writing classes at UCSB very seriously. I think that would have helped me if I had known in the future that I'd be writing so much. And certain partners, especially, I'm thinking of a couple, real sticklers for even basic stuff like, using which versus that and stuff that seems intuitive, but even picking up like a little grammar book has really helped me in my first year.
Yeah, to that, Jones Day, like they had this thing about split infinitives, and I didn't even know what that was when I started, and they just like circle it everywhere you did it. Drove me crazy, but now I never do it. Or passive voice. Never use the passive voice.
I love this. I'm very invested in grammar, so I agree with all of that. If there is a grammar issue in an email from a candidate, I'm like, my eyes there to have to try and it's like, okay, it's a mistake. So I love that. Focus on grammar, go back to basics is really, I think, the takeaway there. Thank you both for all of your insights into this field. I don't know a terrible amount about the legal field, and this was really insightful for me as well. So thank you for sharing your experiences and all of your knowledge with us. Before we end today, I just wanted to remind you all about what we mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is that our next session is on December 9th, Careers in Marketing with Justin. Justin's from Hulu, and he leads, I'm going to get this right by looking at how it's written out, marketing, tech, and ad ops. I need to do that on repeat. Very excited to hear from Justin. And then we're also going to be sending out a short survey for your feedback after the session. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out and giving us some ideas, what you'd like to see change in the future, any other questions that you have for the panelists today, please feel free to connect with them or other council members on LinkedIn, as Leslie mentioned in the chat. And thank you very much for spending some time with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for joining on Veterans Day.
And happy Veterans Day. All right, cheers all. Have a great one.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Jake.
You
Bye,
great.
guys.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks, Karen and Jake.
Yeah.